We're here today to talk about WAR, baseball reference WAR. So I guess for starters, how would you explain WAR to someone who has never heard of it or seen it before?
Yeah, so WAR stands for wins above replacement. And the main goal of it is just to try and assess all the different things that a baseball player can do to affect a team winning or losing. And so really wins is kind of the main goal of it, is to determine how many wins this particular player added to his team. And so the usefulness of that is fairly obvious. If you know how many wins a player can add to a team, adding them to a new team, will presumably help their wins and by that amount. So that's kind of the overview of the idea behind it. Replacement is a topic that often leads to a lot of consternation among people and a lot of concern. There's the idea is that we have a replacement level player. And so the major leagues obviously have the greatest baseball players in the world. And then there's a whole group of players who are available for relatively little money or assets who are playing in AAA and are available to play in the major leagues. So the idea is we can assess how good those players are and then measure how the degree to which a player is better than that replacement level player. Because if a player is not, if a player is just as good as a replacement level player, it's probably no sense in signing them to a free agent contract because you can pretty much freely replace them with somebody in your farm system. And so that's, obviously we're talking about things across averages here, right? The Phillies may not have a good backup catcher in AAA, and so maybe they need to make a trade. But that doesn't. We're not saying that should affect JT Realmuto's wins above replacement. We're comparing him to what we would consider to be an average replacement level player.
Yeah, and I want to get at this because this is something that confuses a lot of my friends when I try to explain this to them. So, a replacement player is not a guy on the bench of a major league team, right? Or even sort of an average player who they might sign. What's that distinction between like the average major leaguer or even a bench major leaguer and a replacement level?
Yeah. So the reason we don't compare them to average is because average players have a huge amount of value, right? I mean, an average player is going to sign a $10 million free agent contract as a free agent because average players are hard to find. There have been plenty of pennants that have been lost because we didn't have an average player playing second base or left field or something like that. And so the idea is that replacement level should be where we essentially set zero for the player's value, right? So if you're not better than a replacement level player, then you're not somebody that that will have a significant amount of value to a Major League Baseball team.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. So can you walk us through sort of the history of WAR, how it was developed and how it came to live on the Baseball Reference website?
Sure. So I'll try to give the quick version because it could go on for quite a while. But there have always been statisticians trying to come up with, I call them Uber metrics, like one overarching metric that measures everything for a player. And so Total Baseball had something called TPR, which is total player rating. Bill James had win shares that he did, I think, in the 90s. And then in the 2000s, Tom Tango, who's currently a Major League Baseball analyst, works at MLB Savant. He kind of published a framework and an idea for wins above replacement. That work also had, maybe coincidentally with that, or perhaps influenced by that. I don't have the timeline exactly right in my head, but Sean Smith, who went by the name Rally Monkey online, created his own WAR metric and published that online, I believe like 2007, 2008 or so. Fangraph soon after published their version of wins above replacement. And then we started working with Sean Smith to integrate his stat into ours. You may know, Jonah, when we first launched WAR, I don't remember exactly when that was, but it's been probably 15 years ago now that happened. And so over the time, there are a lot of refinements. There are dozens of things that go into it. And so maybe we get a little bit better at measuring, the difference between relievers and starting pitchers, or maybe we get better at measuring defense. So all the things that go into that then, are up for discussion, and we try to improve them and modify them. So it's a iterative process getting to where we're at today.
I was like, it can't have possibly been 15 years ago because I was graduated from college, and then I looked and it was 2010, and I graduated in 2009. So I am old.
It was 15 years ago.
So you mentioned Fangraphs, and obviously people I think who are watching this are aware that there are two different versions of WAR. There's Baseball Reference and Fangraphs. Can you walk us through the differences between them and why those exist?
Yeah. So I think the difference for me, and I'm speaking only for myself, but we've collaborated a little bit with Fangraphs in the past on this. For instance, we both set replacement level at the same place, which means that the scale of our WAR numbers are the same. So there's the same amount of I think it's 1,000 wins to get doled out to all the players in Major League Baseball over the course of the season. And so that makes the scale comparable. And we did that pretty early on, like 2012, 2013. I think, if you look at the sites, I think it's fairly obvious that Baseball Reference has a pretty historical bent, in the sense that we want to measure what happened on the field and what the outcome was on the field. Fangraphs, I think, and I think this is accurate, I'm not trying to be unfair, I think it's a reasonable approach, but I think they're more focused on what's this player's value going forward, and what was the value of their performance outside of the context in which it was in which they did it. And so, so for us, it's I would say our measurement is better for things like, who was the more valuable player last year, because, they contributed more to their team's wins. I think Fangraphs would be a better metric to choose if I was looking for which pitcher I wanted to sign in the off season going forward, because I think it correlates better with future performance than ours does. So I think they each have their place. I certainly don't begrudge people using either or. But I think it kind of speaks a little bit to your sense of what the metric is for, with regards to how you would use it.
I think that gets at this, which I don't want to frame. I want to try to steel man, not frame this in the bad faith way of because you hear people say there are two different versions of this stat, therefore it's ridiculous. It's just a construct, it's fake. And I don't really want to.
There's at least three, because you also have Baseball Prospectus as well. So WARP that they have. So yeah, there are many different versions of it.
But I do wonder what you would say to someone who's trying to kind of wrap their mind around the fact that RBI, is a thing that happens on the field, and strikeout is a thing. But there are so many different ways to calculate WAR. How do you kind of how would an intro sort of a novice person how would you explain that to them, why there are these different frameworks?
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's probably a little bit of I probably should be more exact with my terms, but I would say it's just between a statistic and a metric. Probably, I would say a statistic is something you can measure, and you can, it's clear what the, how you can make a clear definition of what an RBI is, and then apply it fairly. Though, working in our business, know that there are a lot of edge cases where somebody screwed up a calculation, or it wasn't quite clear what happened, or so it's not as cut and dried as everybody wants it to be. But in a sense, it's we've all agreed that this is the number of RBIs that that Shohei Ohtani had last year and stuff like that. That's one number. A metric involves a lot of decision making and perhaps assumptions along the way that hopefully you're carefully enumerating those and listing those. We have a very exhaustive glossary on the site about how WAR is calculated. And so, metrics have interpretation as to how they want to do that. And so, probably the most obvious place is on the pitching side. We look at how many runs the pitcher allowed while they were pitching, and then base everything starting with that number. Fangraphs looks at how many strikeouts, home runs, and walks they gave up, and then bases their pitching WAR off those numbers. Okay, and so that's a different starting point. They're looking at what are the things that the pitcher can control directly. That gives us a better sense of their value. We're looking at what happened while the pitcher was on the mound, And then, trying to factor in defense, trying to factor in all other kinds, the opponent quality, stuff like that. So I think you're going to, anytime you're looking at a metric, you're going to end up in different places depending on the implementation decisions you make along the way. And I understand it's people say, why can't we just have one number? The world's complicated, I guess, as I would say. It's probably not a satisfactory answer, but I've in the past I've compared WAR to like gross domestic product, how people calculate that. And that, there's a workbook of like 100 pages or a guidebook of 100 pages to describe how to do that. But even within that, there are implementation details that are left to the person who's trying to implement it. And later on, we get new information, we get better information. We'll go back and restate what GDP was. And sometimes we go back and restate what WAR was based on new measurements, new metrics, new understandings, or new stats that we were able to collect that we didn't have before.
We talked about the replacement part, but I think people sometimes get caught on the win part too. And on the one hand, you get like, this person had 4 walk-off hits. Why don't they have 4 extra wins? Right. On the other hand, you get, their team was terrible. How can they be worth any wins? So kind of, can you walk us through that element of the stat as well?
Right. So we start out, I think a team of replacement level players in our estimate would win 47 games, which I don't remember how many of the White Sox won last year, but it was not too far off from that. But it's pretty rare to have a team that would only win 47 games. So I think I think we've set it pretty low in the sense of what a group of AAA players might actually do in a season. And so in terms of how that applies to the team, if you actually start with that 47 wins and start adding in all the WAR of all the players, you get pretty close to the actual win total the team had. Now, there are things like you pointed out, there are individual stats that there are incidents where a player's impact may be greater because they've bunched their hits in a certain way. They've gotten big strikeouts for their team, whatever it is. Those aspects of the game are important, and it's why I love the game. It's why people watching this probably love the game. And so we're not trying to say none of that matters, but we are saying in kind of an even context or in an average situation, this is what the value of those stats are worth. And then and this kind of gets to the MVP thing, right? People think, oh, well, you're just going to vote for the leader in WAR for MVP. And, why would we even look beyond that? And I generally put an error bar of like 1 win or so around the stat because I know there are these issues. And if you're within a win of somebody, I might look at win probability added, which is only the context in which you took part in the game. I might look at some other stats. I might look at Fangraphs WAR to see what they say about a player. And so I think, no one stat is ever going to give you a perfect signal for what the player's value is. And so intelligently looking at a bucket of different metrics and using those to create a fuller picture of the player is how you should approach it. So, we certainly don't argue for using WAR and WAR alone in evaluating players. We just think it's a useful tool and a pretty handy, very, very rare is the case where it doesn't give you a pretty strong directional view of what the player's value is. And I think so I think that's, that's really the goal. And it's also, I think to bring in, for example, when Aaron Judge hits, 50 plus homers and has a phenomenal season at the plate, it's very hard to say, well, what is a comparable performance for a second baseman or a shortstop? And so, it really does a nice job of putting them on a level playing field in a way that just wasn't possible before. And so, I think it's more right than it's wrong. And I think but it's a tool that it should be one of many in your toolbox, I would say.
Let's get into some of the fun stuff. What are some of the weird sort of edge cases you've come across in the years of calculating WAR?
Well, one question that comes up all the time is, why isn't Shohei Ohtani more valuable because he pitches? And And that's a little bit of a subtle one. He's only pitched in leagues where he's replacing the designated hitter, and so the only so I shouldn't say the only value, but the only additional value his pitching and batting together adds is that, well, you sort of get an extra roster spot that you might not have otherwise. And so, so that's having to account for that is a, something that, we've had to add to, things like the ghost runner, in the extra innings, in run scoring in extra innings is like way higher than run scoring in the regular game. And so we got to make sure we're not penalizing the relief pitcher starting the 10th inning because they're starting with a runner on second base. There are a lot of players, who have negative WAR, significant negative WAR. Trying to think. Those are some of the ones. I usually kind of stick with the implementation details because those are definitely the ones that you remember and the ones that leave scars and stuff like that you have to figure out.
Are there any players whose games you've come to appreciate more after being able to look at them through the WAR framework?
Yeah, I think a great thing the stat does is it really points out the players who are good at all facets of the game rather than just great at one aspect of the game. There are a lot of players who are in the 50 to 70 WAR range who played a long time, but were consistently good in all aspects of the game. So Chase Utley is one. Kenny Lofton is one. Jim Edmonds, the Angels outfielder for a long time, was very good across the board, had good defensive numbers. And a very good hitter. So, those are the types of players that I enjoy. One that's controversial is we have Earl Wilson being comparable to Frank Robinson the year that he won the Triple Crown, which has led to, some people to question the whole basis of the stat. But, I think on the pitching side, it also does a good job of showing pitchers who maybe had great numbers or had pretty good numbers, but were doing it in front of a defense that was terrible and perhaps facing a really good a mix of offensive opponents, right? Because we actually look at it on a game-by-game basis who you're facing. So if you're in a division with the Yankees in the 1960s and maybe the Red Sox, let's say you were one of the East teams that maybe played in a hitter's park, maybe had to face the Yankees, 5 times and the Red Sox 5 times. And that's a significantly different context than being a starting pitcher in Dodger Stadium. And so your numbers, you might have a 3.5 ERA while a Dodger has 2.7 ERA. But I think WAR really evens them out and adjusts for that context and shows, well, that guy actually wasn't as good as he was better than we thought, and this other guy wasn't as good as we thought. So, those are the types of cases that I enjoy looking at and seeing, trying to bring some of those unsung players to light. I think is an important part of the stat.
Was there a moment where you were kind of like, wow, this has really caught on, or any sort of things where you really remember a vibe shift happening in terms of the understanding and acceptance of WAR?
Yeah, I don't think it certainly wasn't overnight, but I think once we started putting it on the site, seeing people using it, I think the backlash was pretty significant in terms of the press. Cause I think we did, not too far into this was the year that Miguel Cabrera won the Triple Crown and Mike Trout, was runner up, I think 2 years in a row for the MVP. And so, that Trout was, again, one of these players who was phenomenal. He was phenomenal across the board. Cabrera, his numbers were helped by being in a pretty good context for him in terms of runners on base and things like that, at least on the RBI side. So, he didn't draw as many walks or get on base as much as Trout did, but he had a higher batting average. So, I think that, I remember some pretty pitched battles online, arguing with people. I remember people taking shots at us in newspapers and stuff like that about the number. But, these days it's I think the numbers are pretty widely accepted. I think all the teams have their own metrics that probably resemble WAR to some degree, but maybe have more advanced components in it than what we're able to muster.
What do you think is the future of WAR as a stat? Are there developments you see coming down the line or anything?
Well, I think the biggest area of discussion is always around defense, right? And so we haven't touched we use Baseball Info Solutions out of Lehigh Valley. They have people watching all the games. They're tracking all the plays that happen, and we're assigning run values based on that. I think their numbers are great, and we have no plans to change that. I think obviously with the StatCast metrics and things like that, there may be an opportunity to look at more tracking based defensive metrics. I'm not sure that they're right, there yet to be used the way we're using BIS. But that's a possibility. I think some of the things like I would be curious how player context on the batting side. We don't really talk about the quality of opposition for batters. But there are definitely situations where, Albert Pujols was in a terrible division for most of his career, and he never got to face the best pitching staff in that division because they were on the Cardinals. And so he was facing, pretty poor pitching staffs, which he was a Hall of Famer anyway, but it does at the edges, it may have an impact, and it's something that would be interesting to take a look at. I think there's probably considerable work that, teams are changing how they're using positions as well. So there may be some opportunity for us to, revisit the weights that we're putting on the different positions, right? Those are probably due for a discussion. And we've been talking about trying to do that at some point. And then just continuing to study what replacement level means, especially as teams are cycling through so many players now in the minor leagues. How does that change what a replacement level player is? Those are all questions that I think we're interested in talking about and studying.